Welcome back. This is week 13, lecture 2, the Catholic Reformation, Counter-Reformation. And this lecture follows very nicely, I think, from the previous lecture, dealing with the developments within the empire from the Confession of Augsburg in 1530 to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. In the previous lecture, I mentioned the Council of Trent and the tensions between Charles V and the popes at the time in terms of dealing with the Protestants, the rebellious princes and cities. But this is then approaching some of those developments, but from the other side, and trying to come to terms with the very concepts we use to describe the past, which is something I've discussed and pointed to throughout, namely that the terms that we use, the concepts we use to describe what we see in the sources, often condition our understanding thereof. In so many ways, a more historical approach needs to start with the sources themselves, the artifacts and texts that are still extant, and based on that analysis of those extant sources, then come to an understanding and develop terms that adequately describe them. But that's getting into another issue in some ways, but it's particularly pertinent to the theme of this lecture because there have been three major terms used to describe. It's even difficult to come up with terms that we aren't already come with pre-packed information to describe the developments within the Catholic sphere during the 16th century. And the first is Counter-Reformation. So maybe I should have called this Counter-Reformation, Catholic Reformation. But scholars at first saw the Catholic attempts to counter the Protestants, beginning first of all with primarily with Luther, but then as Protestantism spread, as the evangelical movement spread, also countering other groups as well. So that reaction was very much emphasized. Then more recently, or I shouldn't say more recently, but after this almost entrenched understanding of Counter-Reformation, we have scholars pointing to the fact that, well, you know what, there was more than just an attempt to counter the Protestants. There was also a genuine tradition of Catholic Reformation or Catholic reform, trying to reform the church, which I'll be talking about shortly. And so that we really should term the Catholic side of things during this period as the Catholic Reformation. Other scholars, then most recently, have suggested that neither of those terms really describe exactly the developments thereof, and what we really should be talking about is early modern Catholicism. So these three primary terms used to describe the developments within the Catholic world of the 16th century, Counter-Reformation, Catholic Reformation, and early modern Catholicism. All have different connotations to them, different coming out from different historical perspectives and different, in some ways, theological perspectives too. And we need to be aware of the implicit meaning packed into those concepts and terms that we use to describe the developments that we see as signified by the extant artifacts and sources. Be that as it may, I just wanted to put forward that we need to, in some ways, come to grips with these three terms, these three concepts, and in so many ways, I would say that, from my perspective, the three actually, instead of being different options, work very well all together because there are different aspects to the developments that we see that certainly merit the labels Catholic Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and early modern Catholicism. So we'll be addressing some of those distinctions and how it's only, in some ways, it's only with accepting all three terms that we can come to a real historical understanding of what was going on at the time. Now, The readings for this week, and I believe, if memory serves, even though I didn't check, the basis for your text analysis 4 on the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. Now, I'll be talking about those shortly. Again, I have posted the spiritual exercises in this module for week 13. In going through the text again, especially since I had to kind of cut and paste, I thought, there has been a fair amount of reading. This is not really the spiritual exercises in the modern translation and edition is not very long, but I thought, okay, I won't give it all of you. I'll just kind of give you sections. And so I give you some of the introductory sections. I give you the first 2 weeks of the actual exercises. And I'll be talking about the spiritual exercises shortly within this lecture. So you have the first 2 weeks, and then you have all the rules. I didn't select from the rules. That's a different section within the spiritual exercises. There are other sections that I chose to leave out. Represented by the ellipsis, the 4 dots. So, it's not everything that is there, but I think it will give you a very good sense of what the spiritual exercises are about, and certainly will help and be sufficient for writing the text analysis 4. Pay particular attention to the rules. Certainly I want you to read the first 2 weeks of the exercises themselves and talk about that. That will help too. But the rules, I think, are really important. I'll be saying a little bit more about that when we get there a little bit later on in this lecture. So with those preliminary remarks, setting the stage, so to speak, I first want to address them in terms of not so much the chronological development of the terms used themselves, but let's look at the developments as they emerged historically. First address those developments with the term the Catholic Reformation. And so here we go to the first slide, Reformation and religionization. Now, religionization is a term that you should recognize because I talked a fair amount about it, not only in lectures, but also in my book, Luther and the Reformation in the Later Middle Ages, precisely because my argument there is that the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages was based on religionization, which I believe I defined as the process or processes by which institutions, individuals, religious orders, for example, sought to inculcate the understanding of what it meant to be a religious, not in the technical sense of joining a monastic order, but as such, going back to Jordan Quellenborg's assertion that every Christian should be a saint. And this idea certainly was very much a part of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and was cannot be identified with Luther's Reformation, even though Luther's concept of the priesthood of all believers and so forth, and the sainthood of all Christians, certainly had its medieval predecessors or background to it. Whether or not he was aware of Jordan's works, certainly his sermons, it was probably doubtful that he had read Jordan's sermons when Jordan talks about the need for all Christians to be a saint. But he may have, but it also could have been an independent development set aside over against the concept that was there in the later Middle Ages, as well as previously, that the truly religious are those that enter the state of being religious, i.e. entering a religious order. And so therefore most people within medieval Christendom were not religious. I mean, this is getting back to the technical definition of what is religion and what is therefore being a religious. And I think I mentioned that it was actually a legal definition, entering in statu religionis, in the state of religion. And we need to really realize that the term religion meant different things within the medieval period and even the early modern period that we're talking about than it usually does today, at least based on how it is so often used in a general sense. So Jordan's assertion that all Christians should be saints and all Christians should be religiosi, religious, was really quite astounding at the time. And that concept, even if not directly derived from Jordan, Luther developed further, and on we go. But that process of religionization, the means of teaching people, of inculcating in them how they should be, can be, and ought to be, if I'm being repetitious, but I'm sorry about that. To be religious. What is meaning? What does it mean to live a religious life, a Christian life? And so, in some ways, Jordan, later Luther, but with different emphases. And so, was arguing that every Christian should be a religious, and simply being Christian and the Christian life itself was the religious life. That was a relatively new concept. And I'm not saying that Jordan was the only person advocating for that in the later Middle Ages, but he certainly was a major one. And I probably can say that he's basically the only one that I have seen or know of that has made that argument as explicitly as he did. And so that is really the late medieval Reformation. What we see with the Catholic Reformation is the continuation of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. But the Reformation of the later Middle Ages continues in what we have called Catholic Reformation as we move into the 16th century. And this will be a major issue that I'll be talking about also later on in this lecture, that a real demarcation between Catholic attempts at Reformation, at reform, and Protestant attempts, aside from the obvious relationship to the institutional church in Rome, was that the Catholic side of things focused on religionization, both in the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and on into the 16th century, whereas the Protestants ended up being based on confessionalization. And in the lectures for next week, I'll be talking more about confessionalization. It really starts with Confession of Augsburg, and that's a process or processes by which a given political territory is defined based on a particular religious confession, which is a document or documents, as a means of territorial state building. But I'll be talking more about that again next week. So, but to approach the phenomena, in the plural, phenomena of Catholic reform, Catholic Reformation, early modern Catholicism, I think we really need to see it as the continuation of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And in that sense, the whole point was not to completely restructure the church, but to certainly to reform it. And so here again, we meet this distinction between reform and Reformation. How do we go make that distinction? How do we demarcate one from the other? I've argued that in the later Middle Ages, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages failed because it didn't really affect or bring about a reformation of the church, even though the calls were there. The calls were based on religionization and ameliorization, which is there. The third term, ameliorate, means to make better, to clean up. In that sense, it was based on reform rather than reformation as a new departure. Now, we've already talked about the humanist reform circles. I talked about the circles in France, being kind of the network of humanist reform circles, kind of coordinated by Marguerite of Navarre, sister of Francis I. And certainly Erasmus of Rotterdam was in this camp, as well as were many of the German humanists, who at first supported Luther, but then they thought, wait a minute, he's really going too far. There's the old saying that you may have heard of. Certainly, any of you who are my age, I'm sure have heard of it. Don't throw out the baby with the bath. And what that saying gets at is, the bath water gets dirty, so we drain out the bath water, but don't throw out the entire baby too, because the baby is what you're trying to clean up. In some ways, that is the distinction. The Reformation, the Protestants wanted to get rid of the baby. The Catholics are saying that no, we need to clean up, we need to get rid of the dirty bathwater, but we don't get rid of the baby too. We don't throw out the baby with the bath. Now that's kind of a banal analogy, but I think I think it gets at a central point in terms of that distinction between Reform and Reformation. Um, as it was moving forward, not only originally with Luther's movement and evangelical preaching and those kinds of issues, which could certainly were a major platform for reform, even as they also became a platform for developing Reformation. So it becomes very difficult. We can't just say, okay, we see calls for evangelical preaching, we see calls for education of the clergy, for critiques of the corruption within the institutional hierarchy. That was very common, and it doesn't mean that that is always Protestant, certainly. And again, there was no such thing as Protestants until 1529. And it doesn't even entail Reformation as such. It just means reform. We need to really clean up our act. We need to set our own house in order. Clean house, not clean out the house, but clean house. Let's get our act together and move forward in a much better position. And in some ways, that encapsulates the Catholic Reformation. The Catholic Reformation, what has been used to refer to the Catholic Reformation, was, at least in part, reform efforts stemming from the continuation of the late medieval Reformation. They can say, well, wait a minute. You've said that the Reformation in the later Middle Ages, Reformation in the later Middle Ages was not just reform, it was truly a Reformation. And it was. And I think we need to accept that and recognize that that was what was being called for. And if you go back and look at the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund, again, recalling that to mind, what the author was calling for was a pretty radical cleaning up of things. He was not arguing that we should throw out the baby. He was not arguing that the whole structure of the institutional church should be overthrown. Now, Marsilius of Padua in 1324, in his Defensor of the Peace, Defensor Paces, was arguing that, at least with respect to the papacy, that the papacy should be abolished. So there's that element that was there. There's always critique of the institutional church. And some of it could be more radical than others. But we can't say, let's say, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages was truly a call for reformation, but a call for reformation that was based on amelioration, that is, reform, as we go forward. And let's say the predominant manifestations of that were beginning within the humanist reforms, and then some of those humanist reformers advocating for reform went along with Luther, such as Philip Melanchthon. Others, such as Erasmus, said, we're all with you, Martin, for your critiques, but you go too far. So it's really a sense of how far do we go? What is really needed to take care of the problems that were more generally acknowledged as being legitimately there? And this aspect of, let's say, early modern Catholicism as the most general term and the most historical term encompassed both Catholic Reformation as reform and Counter-Reformation, because we cannot say that there was not a concerted effort to counter the Protestants, even within the ongoing attempts of the Catholics to set their own house in order, to reform, and make things better. But when you have this splinter group, as it was increasingly becoming within the empire and then beyond, we also have to counter that. We can't simply say, okay, you are a valid option, you're going against us. Just as in the medieval Christendom, within medieval Christendom, a number of groups were proclaimed as heretical because they were critiquing the church more broadly. And no one was surprised that the church was being critiqued, and there was critique of the church that was not proclaimed heretical. But it depends on how far you would go. And that was in some ways the same phenomena is part of the dilemma of the 16th century. And how far do we go? And once groups were clearly, let's say, outside the pale um, of the traditional institutionalized church, um, then countering measures would have to be put forward, because it's not simply an issue of dealing with dissidents, it's an issue of dealing with schismatics, and that's a problem. So, looking at the efforts to counter, let's say the Counter Reformation as one faction of early modern Catholicism, um, we have one, two, three, four, five, six um, major planks, let's say, of the attempt to counter the Protestants. And we have up there the first two is condemnation and propagation. That were the first two and the earliest, in that, from the condemnation, excommunication of Luther, on we go. And then, as I talked about a few lectures ago, in terms of propaganda and the printing press, I talked about how Luther dominated the media, and I showed you some of the images with woodcuts. And then I also said, too, that the Catholics were kind of slow to take that all up, but they started doing so also with images of Luther that were very derogatory, just as the images that would circulate with Luther's works and sermons and pamphlets and Flugschriften were also very derogatory to the Pope and the papacy, as I think was pretty clear in that lecture and the images that I showed you. But the Catholics did try at first. But when we see developments, and if you look at the dates there, going into the uh, later 1530s into the 1540s, we see almost a shift to more active measures to counter the Protestants and to counter the Protestantism, which, of course, if you put this in context of the previous lecture, this is when the tensions within the empire have built to the point of a Cold War. With the League of Schmalkalden being established in 1531, tensions with the emperor, even with the Nuremberg standstill, there's still such tension involved, and there's really almost a mobilization of the Catholic position. Now, it wasn't whole hog. It wasn't a unified movement. There were certainly reform circles, reform factions within that were remaining loyal to Rome, in that they did not want to throw out the baby, but were very critical of what was going on. And one of the major leaders of some of these reform efforts, as well as being open to them, was Pope Paul III. Pope Paul III was certainly a pope, and he accepted his position as pope in a traditional sense, and yet he realized that something needed to be done and that we should maybe introduce reforms. He didn't last all that long. I did not check on the dates of Paul III. My apologies, but he's in the 1530s. But then he's succeeded by Paul IV, and Paul IV was more reactionary. Paul IV started saying we need to actively stamp this out and get rid of this heresy, Protestantism. And if we look at these next developments in terms of the platforms, of the planks of the platform of the Counter Reformation, we see after condemnation and propaganda, the first two, we see the Roman Inquisition, the Index of Prohibited Books, the Society of Jesus, and the Council of Trent. All basically developments of the 1540s. Now, we have an issue with the Roman Inquisition. I have it there 1542, which is when the Roman Inquisition was established. The subpoints on this slide underneath the Roman Inquisition was first the medieval Inquisitions. There was no such thing as the Inquisition or the medieval Inquisition. Inquisition simply means investigation. It is an investigation into a potential crime, in this sense, heresy. There certainly were medieval inquisitors, individuals who were appointed as inquisitors to go and investigate a case. Jordan was appointed as an inquisitor to a case in Erfurt and then in Magdeburg, that he had to handle the problems. But there was no centralized institution that we can point to of the medieval Inquisition. The first institutional Inquisition was the Spanish Inquisition, which was established in 1478 by the still joining realms of Aragon and Castile, Ferdinand and Isabella, and they felt that they needed to go a bit further and institutionally and formally set up a means of systematically ridding their realms of heresy. There was also not just potential heresy at the time, but also a real problem in Spain at the time was the Jews. In 1492, same year as Columbus, in some ways what was far more significant, at least for the internal workings of Spain, Castile and Aragon, was the decision to expel the Jews, to say, okay, from our realms, any Jews that live here either have to convert and become Christian or have to leave. There have been a number of expulsions of Jews. And those who converted were seen as seen very skeptically. Like, did they really convert, or are they just saying that? And to determine whether or not these converted Jews, conversos, as they were called, were genuine or not, that was one of the primary motivations behind establishing the Spanish Inquisition. So this is a formalized institution now, which had not been previously a formalized, centralized institution. The Roman Inquisition is not established until 1542. So it's very late in coming, and it was designed to stamp out heresy, primarily the Protestants. We have records from the Inquisition, and so we know what some of the cases were like to be brought before the Roman Inquisition. It was not necessarily as feared as was the Spanish Inquisition, but it still was a significant institutional weapon used against the Protestants. So with that aspect, it was dangerous to be brought before the Inquisition. Now, obviously, Luther, if he had been captured in 1542, 43, 44, and handed over to Rome, he would have ended up before the Inquisition. Maybe. He may have just immediately been proclaimed a heretic and executed. But the job of the Inquisition was to discern and dig out heretics, i.e. Protestants, clandestine Protestants, to make that line, draw that line between critics who were seeking reform and critics who wanted to throw out the baby, get rid of the whole institutional structure of the medieval church. So that was one plank, as well as condemnation and the propaganda. A second plank was what's called the Index of Prohibited Books. The indexes, or the indices, I should say, of prohibited books, because you'll see there, the first one was at Paris, and then at Louvain, and then finally at Rome in 1559. This had been, in some ways, going all the way back to Diocletian and the Great Persecution, a way of saying, okay, how do we get rid of a movement? We get rid of the books. We get rid of the books and the leaders. If we can get rid of the books and the leaders, the movement will dissipate. That approach didn't work for Diocletian, and it has really never worked. Burning books and banning books and burning books has never really worked, even though it kind of seems like a good idea if you're on the side of we have to get these ideas out of here. It has never really worked, and it didn't work in the 16th century. But the attempt was made, the same basis, condemnation of the leaders. Let's proclaim them as heretics, and then let's get rid of the writings. I already mentioned with Luther, with the Edict of Worms in 1521. Luther was to be captured and sent to Rome to be tried for heresy, and all of his writings were to be confiscated and burned. That was a way of getting rid of it. If we can just get rid of these writings, we can preserve um, good understanding of teaching. So that the index was really there. And I said, you can see there the list of the first at Paris, University of Paris, put books on the index. And these were books that were to be on the index until they could be expurgated or exterminated. Now, expurgation is simply fixing up. We have a number of works that were later printed with what was called the expurgated passages noted. I've studied one a lot, Antonius Rampogolis. I think I may have mentioned him as talking about the observant movement in the later Middle Ages. He's one of my Augustinian hermits. And his Figuri Bibliorum was ended up on the index, first at Paris and then later at Rome, until expurgated. And then the expurgated edition is, very interestingly enough, doesn't change anything. It just gives a list of what should be changed. Anyway, it's some things were, Erasmus was ended up on the index, and a lot of other people were ended up on the index. But it doesn't mean that everyone who ended up on the index, their works were actually, confiscated and burned. That was only reserved for the worst offenders, such as Luther, or the attempt to do so. But it's a way of saying, okay, we need to make things better. Now, you may have already heard in terms of Counter-Reformation sensibilities that the popes had painters paint fig leaves over Michelangelo's nude figures in the Sistine Chapel. And so that is expurgation. That's saying, okay, we can't really have these images out there. They're too lascivious or potentially lascivious. Even though it was never a problem before, all of a sudden it's like, no, we don't want to have, private parts being displayed. So we have to cover them up. That's expurgation. And the same thing was applied with the index. And funny enough, when I have up here the censors and expurgation, there were people who worked as censors and expurgators of different works. And a good friend of mine, at the University of Missouri, had, and this is kind of an inside story, so I'm not going to even give his name, but you can look him up. Oh, John Freimeyer, you'll know it. And this is a story he told, because when we were graduate students together, and he was working in Tübingen, he was working very closely with a scholar by the name of Peter Godwin, who was a great Neo-Latinist. And Godwin gained permission from the prefect of the Vatican Library, the head of the Vatican Library, to actually get access in the archives to some of these records. He was writing a book on Robert Bellarmine, 17th century figure, but also some earlier figures as well. And this was before the kind of the opening up of the archives and library. The library was pretty much open, but the archives were kind of kept secret and closed. And they still are very much guarded. A lot has been opened up, made available to researchers and scholars, but it's still, there's guarded. It's kind of like a bit like classified documents that eventually may be made public, but for the time being they are not to be made public. That was what's going on with the archives. And Godwin received permission, and was like one of the first to get into the archives and look at some of these, which up to that time had been classified documents relating to the Inquisition and to the index and the censorship. And my friend John was kind of his assistant, so he was able to go in there and do a lot of Godwin's work for him. And he came across some fun stuff. One of the things he came across was that the censors, and this is not a general policy, this is just individuals working in there, but he found a censored copy of the Bible. And some censor had gone through the Bible to censor it. and made notes on what should be censored. And he said explicitly, this has to be changed because it is not in keeping with Thomas Aquinas. And I said, oh, John. Now, John was working on censorship at the time. So he was actually, with Godman's blessing, going into the archives and doing his own research, not the research for Godman. And so I said, you got to publish it. This is so fantastic to see a censor censoring the Bible. He goes, yeah, because I can't. What do you think would happen if I published this? He said, they would know that I wasn't doing God's work. It would be horribly embarrassing, and they would close everything down again. So it would be counterproductive to the opening up of the archives into scholarship. So John says, I can't do it. And John, I can tell you a lot of stories about John. So that was just some of the fun things. He did write a book on printing and censorship. But he didn't include those stories, I don't think. I have to go back and look, but I don't think he did. But that's to the level it went. Saying, okay, we have to ensure doctrinal uniformity. Now, I'm not even saying that the popes would have agreed with that censor, that the Bible should be censored at all. Probably that would have been very tricky at the time. But the point is that there was a censor thinking he was doing his job and doing it as faithfully as he possibly could, that censored the Bible based on Thomas Aquinas. Now, so be it. That was a way to then clean up works that maybe were too critical, that could lead one into a path towards a Protestant position, to purge them of their errors, and then to be allowed to be published. If you've ever looked at a book published by a Catholic author prior to at least 1970, you'll see two stamps or statements in the book, published book. One is called the Nihil Obstat, which is based on the censors saying nothing is here to be expurgated. There's nothing problematic with this work. And then the imprimatur. The imprimatur is, and it has permission, official papal permission to be published. Those two aspects, the nihil obstat and the imprimatur, were means still into modern times, obviously, into relatively recent times, that the institutional church used to control what would be seen as acceptable Catholic publications. Now, that has since fallen by the wayside. I'm not saying it's never used anymore, but it's not a requirement anymore. But that gets into the whole opening up of the Roman Catholic Church in the 20th century. Anyway, so that's the function of censorship, was to try to make things acceptable. But censorship, banning books, has never worked. And it didn't work in the 16th century either. Some of the most banned books became instant bestsellers, so to speak. Now, this brings us then to the last two planks, the Society of Jesus and the Council of Trent. And I'm just going to go through, first of all, the Society of Jesus and then the Council of Trent, and move on from there, because these were probably the most effective means for countering the Protestants. The Society of Jesus starts with Ignatius of Loyola. Now, the Society of Jesus is perhaps better known as the Jesuit order. What we call today the Jesuits are members of the Society of Jesus. It was a new religious order that Ignatius of Loyola founded. Now, there we have Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish nobleman. His dates: he was a soldier, a nobleman, a soldier, and in one battle he was injured pretty severely, taken to the hospital. And in his recuperation, he asked for edificatory literature to read to help him, get through. He's already a Catholic. If you see the Ignatius's conversion, 1521, this is still pretty early on, right? So it's not an issue of him being Protestant. It's just his natural, medieval knightly valor, and saying, okay, I'm recuperating. I need spiritual edification. I'm going to read two different books. Not that I'm already aware of them, but I'm going to just read them again and again. Ludolf of Saxony's Vita Christi, and then the Golden Legend, or the Legenda Aurea. Now, the Legenda Aurea was a collection of saints' lives. It was the most prevalent collection of saints' lives at the time. And thereafter as well. It was medieval, dates from probably the early 13th century, late 12th, early 13th century. And it was something that everybody knew. And the issue of saints' lives was also taken over later by the Protestants, called Books of Martyrs. They'd have basically the heroes of Protestantism, their lives and the stories would be recounted, just as with the Catholic side. That gets to another issue later on, but the point is, in some ways, everybody needs their heroes, and the saints had always been the heroes of medieval Christendom, and that was just continuing. So the Legenda Aurea, everything from the biblical saints to more recent saints, contemporary saints at the time of the author. And that was what one of the things that Ignatius wanted to read during his recuperation. The other was Ludolf of Saxony's Vita Christi, which is just Latin for the life of Christ. It was a rather large book going through the entire life of Christ. And Ludolf of Saxony was a Carthusian monk. And funnily enough, Ludolf, one of his major sources, especially for the Passion of Christ, but also for his treatment of the Sermon on the Mount. Even though he does not cite him, Ludolf drew word for word from Jordan of Quedlinburg, our Jordan, my Jordan, both from his exposition of the Lord's Prayer as well as in his meditations on the Passion of Christ, which I think I've talked about briefly anyway. And Ludolf takes that over. And Ludolf's Vita Christi became one of the most popular works from that time on. It's mid 14th century, and from that time it became distributed very, very widely. Not wildly. It was distributed wildly too, but widely is what I wanted to say. And it was so heavily influenced by Jordan, but yet he doesn't cite Jordan, and that is one of the reasons why Jordan has been overlooked, because so many people have looked at Ludolf and attributed developments to Ludolf, which actually were innovations by Jordan. But that gets back into that aspect. But those were the two sources: this Life of Christ and Stories of the Saints that Ignatius was reading, meditating on, and led to his conversion, not a conversion from paganism to Christianity. He was definitely a Christian, but they're from soldier to soldier for Christ. His conversion to saying, okay, I'm going to dedicate my life to a Christian life of service, not the life of the Christian noble fighting. He still was fighting. He became influenced there in Spain after he got out of the hospital, started working on his new life. He joined some circle, or became associated with some of the circles of the Alumbrados, that's there, a Spanish term, which were groups of predominantly women, not exclusively, but predominantly women, who were very interested in reform, calling for reform of the church based on a spiritualism, almost going to the extremes of a mysticism. Now, I've talked about mysticism before, and how mysticism is always suspect because it is claiming a direct revelation from God outside the institutional structure of the church. And a number of Alumbrados, and Ignatius as well, was brought before the Spanish Inquisition. Now, again, I talked about how the Inquisition was an investigation, primarily. Ignatius, I think, appeared twice was brought before the Spanish Inquisition. Twice, both times acquitted. Meaning they brought him in to talk to him and said, "Okay, yeah, you're very borderline here, but you're okay. You know, you're not. You haven't crossed the line yet." But that is kind of the milieu that Ignatius was developing his religious devotion and religious life within. And he realized that he needed to not just be a spiritual person, but he also needed theological training. So he starts studying theology. He receives his doctorate in theology from Paris in 1535 and starts um, a mission of converting the pagans of the New World. That was his goal, was to go and evangelize the new territories. Of course, he had to start with doing that, encountering the Protestants. And he had a number of friends following him, and his group received official recognition from the Pope in 1540, 1541 as the Society of Jesus, as the Jesuits. Now, the Jesuits, um, as I said, are still very prevalent around today. Um, a little bit different from their 16th century version, as we'll see in a second, but still a very important religious order for the Roman Catholics. And they had then four major positions in terms of their order, what they were about, and their goals. One was countering heresy. That was one of the primary goals of the Society of Jesus, of the Jesuits, was to counter the Protestant heresy. That's what we're talking about. Another was missionary work and teaching, not only within Europe, but also overseas. This is when the age of exploration and the new discoveries, at least from the European perspective, not certainly as such, of the so-called New World. Also then in Asia, with the new routes and the quicker routes being discovered in terms to get to Asia. And so it was both to the Far East and to the New World that we need to evangelize and missionary activity out there. And the Jesuits had a very strong presence, and that's a whole other story. But that was part of their very foundational ideal and purpose for their whole order. To do so, um, Ignatius realized that just as he did for himself, that he needed to be taught. Couldn't just have this spiritual religious feeling. We had to be trained in theology. The Jesuits were, by definition, and mandate a learned order. They had to have university training. They had to go on for a doctorate, and even still today, to become a full Jesuit, a full member of the Jesuit order. I think I could be wrong, but I think requires you to get your PhD in some discipline. It doesn't have to be theology by any means, but you have to take your education and learning as far as it can possibly go. And that is the real foundation of being a Jesuit. In some ways, one of my books, my first book, Highway to Heaven, um, was listed on, actually, I think it was a Spanish, I think it was a Spanish or Italian bookseller online. And it listed the title, and it gave my name, author Eric Leland Sack, and it added S.J. afterwards. And I thought, how neat. I've been promoted. They're calling me a Jesuit. S.J. is the abbreviation for the Society of Jesus, just like OESA is the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine. OP is the Order of Preachers for the Dominicans and so on, and SJ is the designation for the Jesuits. Now, I'm not a Jesuit. I've never been a Jesuit, but I thought it was a great compliment, and it's still kind of funny because a Jesuit is so highly trained. Um, you can say about the Jesuits what you will, but you have to respect their intellect and their academic training. And that started with the original Jesuits, and Ignatius is taking the lead based on his own experiences as he's developing from a soldier to soldier for Christ. We have to be a learned order. as well educated as we possibly can. Um, and then we have the fourth plank, so to speak, or goal, other monastic vows. Traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Jesuits said, and we will add a fourth vow. Not only just obedience to our superiors, but obedience to the Pope. Now, if you remember, when I talked about Luther taking his vows within the Augustinian observance, within the Augustinian order, he vowed obedience to Christ, to Mary, and to the head of the order. He did not vow obedience to the Pope. The Jesuits vowed obedience to the Pope. And when you read the spiritual exercises, that will almost maybe smack you in the face in some ways. And I have it there a later document, official document called the Ratio Studiorum in 1599. That was the platform of Jesuit education. It's basically the rationale of studies and the plan of studies. Um, the Jesuits became teachers, missionary work in teaching, a learned order. So we are going to teach. We're going to establish schools because how are we going to change people? How are we going to counter heresy? We are going to teach people the truth. And we're going to know the tradition better than the Protestants. We're going to know the scriptures better than the Protestants. We're going to know logic and debate better than the Protestants. And we are going to educate the people, and that will show them the truth. And that, too, has been perhaps one of the most long-lasting influences of the Jesuits with schools and institutions. You probably, here we have Brebeuf, which is a Jesuit institution. They're Jesuit universities, and so it's Georgetown was founded as a Jesuit institution. They made a huge impact in terms of their dedication to education and teaching as part of their missionary activity, as part of their mission as such, based on the learnedness of the order in combating heresy, and with that fourth vow of a special obedience of the Pope, to doing so within obedience to the institutional church as such. Now, the reason I say it's kind of funny because Jesuits, if you know anything about more recent developments in the later 20th century, and still, the Jesuits have gotten themselves into a lot of hot water in that their intellectual acumen has often led them into conflict with the church hierarchy. And so in some ways, what you'll see, and we'll talk about shortly, that fourth vow has come into question. I don't know if they still take that fourth vow today or not. In some ways, I wouldn't be surprised either way if they dropped it or if they still adhere to it. But then it becomes an issue of, but what does that mean? And is it adhering to the truth actually obedience to the true Pope, Pope better informed, which is what Luther was appealing to as well. So the Jesuits, I think they're fantastic, whatever you might think of them, in terms of theologically speaking, or even politically speaking. But just seeing their argumentation, their intellect, they're still quite impressive. And so you can even disagree with them, but still be impressed by them. That's why I mentioned that. But there's a coordinated, conscious program of establishing schools and teaching as a part of their mission to counter heresy and to teach the truth based on their extraordinary emphasis on learning and obedience to the Pope. Another aspect, then, that the Ignatius did as the basis for his order was he wrote what's called the spiritual exercises. And these were a pretty extensive program for examining one's own spirituality, for one's soul. If you remember, again, as I said with Ignatius, he had this period of recuperating from his injuries where he meditated on and read intensively Ludolf of Saxony's Vita Christi and the Golden Legend. Well, in some ways, his own experience became part of his order, not only in terms of the learnedness of the order and the requirement for education within the order, but also the spiritual aspects that he had from early on with the Alumbrados in Spain and such, to develop your spiritual life. And his spiritual exercises became a classic. Consists of a 4-week program That's why I said I give you the first 2 weeks in terms of the program itself in the readings for this week. But then also includes the rules, includes other considerations. So it's a far more lengthy document. But as I said to preface this lecture, that all the rules are there, and when you read it, you'll see too. One of the rules, one of the last rules, is thinking with the church. That gets to that vow of obedience. And Ignatius writes, I will see the black object I see, or the object I see that is black, I will believe that it is white, if so deemed by the Holy Father. That is a principle. Again, Jesuits today would say, well, I may, but we have to understand it correctly. Anyway, so they'll kind of wiggle their way around it, out of it, because the Jesuits are fantastic. But anyway, that's another issue. But that approach, that obedience to the Pope, as I said, was not part of the traditional monastic vows. Certainly not vows that Luther took. Became the fourth vow for the Jesuits. If we can think of contemporary analogies, the Jesuits became the stormtroopers for the Pope. I don't mean to necessarily say there's an equivalency there, because the stormtroopers in Star Wars aren't all that effective when it comes down to it. The Jesuits were very effective, but that was what they were really trying to be, the avant-garde against the Protestants, for the papacy, for the institutional church going forward. And that was then based on learning, on mission, and the spiritual exercises, developing your spirituality as well. Now, Council of Trent. The Council of Trent became, let's say, together with the Jesuits, the second most effective and significant and long-lasting institution and impact of the Counter-Reformation. Here with the Council of Trent, it's not just a Counter-Reformation, it's also Catholic Reform, Catholic Reformation. I mentioned in the previous lecture some of the tensions between Charles and the Protestant estates in the empire over a council, how it's kind of in light of conciliarism of the 15th century, and again the Council of Constance of the Degree Frequens and Haec Sancta. It was problematic for both emperor and pope. But and there was a council called in 1512, the Fifth Lateran Council, and then Luther breaks out. So it's a real problem. And calls to a council was even more a problem because Luther was appealing to a council over the Pope. Luther was saying that what we need to do to deal with indulgences and everything else, we need a general council. So this call for a council was seen as suspect because it was seen as coming from a heretical perspective. And yet everybody realized that's what we really need. We need to get together and hash some of these problems out. And Paul III got close to calling a council, but couldn't really pull it off politically. Paul IV did, and the Council of Trent opened in 1545. It met until 1563. I mean, not continuously. There was different sessions, like 3 different sessions. And I have it there, the Decrees of Trent as confessional document. I'll come back to that because it actually becomes that. Trent set the policy for the Roman Catholic Church from its close in 1563 until the Second Vatican Council opened in 1962. That is the impact of the Council of Trent on Roman Catholicism. Now, the first thing, or one of the first things the council did when it opens, was issue a decree on justification. Now, I mentioned the interim in the previous lecture, and how after Charles won his decisive victory at Muhlberg, he then imposed this interim on his territories to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to wait for the Council of Trent to finish its job, to finally settle the matter. But in the interim, Protestants may continued having married clergy. Protestants can continue celebrating the Mass, key term, Mass in both kinds, giving the bread and the wine to the laity, um, and then a formula of justification that maybe was not satisfactory to either side, but it was there. And since Luther had written so much about the issue of justification, the Council of Trent said, okay, we're going to start there too. We are going to get our act together and show, number one, what our position is. Because Luther's claims against us in terms of meriting salvation, in terms of works righteousness, that had never been actually the official teaching of the church. It's always, and it's in the pastoral theology and preaching is always kind of difficult, but I already pointed out that Pelagianism had been condemned in 418, the idea that you can merit your salvation. And so they set forth a decree of justification. And I've cut and pasted from that two passages from that decree. One shortly follows the other. It's not the entire decree on justification, but I just want you to read those. And I have the text for you right here. I'm just going to read part of it right to you right now. This is the Council of Trent. The causes of this justification are: the final cause, indeed, is the glory of God and of Christ and life eternal. The efficient cause is truly a merciful God who gratuitously washes and sanctifies, signing and anointing with the Holy Spirit of promise, who is the pledge of our inheritance. But the meritorious cause is his most beloved, only begotten Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, who, when we were enemies, for the exceeding charity wherewith he loved us, merited justification for us by his most holy passion on the wood of the cross, and made satisfaction for God, for us to God the Father. The instrumental cause is the sacrament of baptism, which is the sacrament of faith, without which no one is ever justified. Finally, the unique formal cause is the justice of God, not that by which he himself is just, but by which he makes us just. That namely, by which, when we are endowed with it by him, we are renewed in the spirit of our mind, and not only are we reputed, but we are truly called and are just, receiving justice within us, each one according to his own measure, which the Holy Spirit distributes to everyone as he wills, and according to each one's own disposition and cooperation. Now, with that passage, the line, the justice of God, that was the key issue for Luther. The justice of God. Not that by which he himself is just, but by which he makes us just. That is almost word for word of Luther's formulation of his discovery of passive righteousness. Here it is in the decree on justification from the Council of Trent. Now, I've made that point before, that Luther's discovery of passive righteousness was not necessarily anything new, even if it was not the prevalent doctrine of justification that was being taught at the time. Trent goes back to a more Thomistic position following Thomas Aquinas, which was based on faith and grace and God's passive righteousness that is then enshrined in the decrees of Trent. That, I think, is important to note. Another important thing to note about this passage is also in terms of the difference with Luther. But we are truly called. This is not only are we reputed, but we are truly called and are just, receiving justice within us. That is intrinsic righteousness and justification. For Luther, it was extrinsic. It was extra nos, was his phrase. There's a great book written by Siegfried Rader and scholar in Tübingen, was in German, called nos extra nos, us and outside of us. And that was one of the real things, that extrinsic righteousness for Luther righteousness is not what is in us at all. We don't become righteous. Christ is righteousness. Christ is our righteousness. He attributes, God will attribute Christ's righteousness to us. It's not our own. Here, as in the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, as in the Augustinian tradition, and in some ways Thomas, as a opposed necessarily to Thomism. That's a whole other issue. Um, was very influenced by Augustine as well. He's not a late medieval Augustinian, but there's this very strong Augustinian element in Thomas's theology, Thomas himself, that is, until it's further developed in the Augustinian hermits in the 14th century. And here we see this enshrined in the canons of Trent, the doctrines of the decrees of Trent. Now, the next passage here, just the next slide. But when the apostle says that man is justified by faith and freely, these words must be understood in that sense in which the uninterrupted consent of the Catholic Church is held and expressed, namely that we are therefore said to be justified by faith. Because faith is the beginning of human salvation, the foundation and root of all justification, without which it is impossible to please God and to come to the fellowship of his sons, and are therefore said to be justified gratuitously, because none of these things which precede justification, whether faith or works merit the grace itself of justification. For if it is grace, it is not now by reason of works, otherwise grace is no more grace. Now we could characterize this position as one of sola gratia and sola fide. Those are Luther's slogan terms. Sola gratia, sola fide. Trent has the same one, has the same position. Now, there are differences, certainly. And I've then included a slide here that I think diagrams the differences of the various positions in terms of justification and its relationship to sanctification. You could say, okay, we're getting into theology here. We are, but I'm doing it as the history of theology, not as historical theology. I'm not arguing which is the right position. But I want to just to demarcate the various positions to help clarify it. Because again, the distinctions between Luther and Trent and the traditional medieval position were so narrow in some ways, meaning it's almost the difference between intrinsic righteousness and extrinsic righteousness, the major division, or the relationship between justification and sanctification. But this was to have major implications politically, socially, religiously, for the rest of the period and for still up to today. Are there differences? Definitely. But we can't say it's one of justification by faith as opposed to justification by works. The Roman Catholic tradition has never been one that was based on works. Works are essential and important after justification. But we'll see that then if we look to this next slide, positions on justification and sanctification. The first one is a general medieval position and pastoral position, whereby sanctification leads to justification, intrinsic righteousness. Now, here I say the general medieval position. It would be too lengthy and problematic to go into all the various positions on justification and its relationship to sanctification in the Middle Ages. The pastoral position places sanctification before justification, because what is the point of preaching to people is to teach, yes, it's also to get them to lead a Christian life. And so it's trying to get people to act, to do the right thing, to live in the right way. That is then almost implicitly, even if not theologically, doctrinally, saying you need to clean up your life, you need to become holy to be justified. That's kind of the carrot at the end of the road. Was it the overall position on a popular level? Probably. On a theological level, it was far more diverse, and so that's really kind of a misnomer that I've laid it as a general medieval position, because Trent affirms that the whole Catholic tradition is based on justification by faith and justification by grace. The late medieval Augustinian position, which is also there, very much there, as I could say in Thomas too, is based on intrinsic righteousness, meaning what's it really in us, whereby justification comes first, which leads to sanctification. Luther's position is that justification and sanctification are distinct, and that is the extrinsic righteousness. We do not become more holy. Luther says, our lives, this is not about morals, this is not about sanctification. He says, our lives are no better than the papists. We're just as bad as they are. But we're right, because it's not about morals or ethics or sanctification. It's about the fundamental theological principles of justification, and that justification is extrinsic. So yes, it's based on passive righteousness. But for Luther, that all important extra nos, that our justification, our righteousness is not one that is within us. We don't become righteous. It is Christ himself. That Christ is our righteousness. And Christ's righteousness then is attributed to us. So the Trent Council decree and justification, not only are we reputed to be righteous, but we actually are. That is the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic righteousness. And we have with Trent, justification leading to sanctification. Now, which is basically the late medieval Augustinian position as such. Now, when we look at this, it's never been an issue of the debate between justification by works or justification by faith. It's never the issue of, works righteousness over grace. In so many ways, Luther was simply espousing what was traditional good Catholic teaching and always had been. Even if the theology that he was taught at the time, after the schism, in this age of crisis, was that first position of sanctification leading to justification. To what extent, then, was Luther right? We have Catholic theologians that will say Luther was right about so many things, and the decrees of the Council of Trent prove it, because there's very little difference if we look at the formulations. But the big difference is that intrinsic righteousness as opposed to external righteousness, extrinsic righteousness. That was the difference. And that was, in some ways, the all-important difference. It was not faith and works. It was not meriting or earning salvation or paying for it or anything like that whatsoever. It was basically that development of Luther's when he came to see that justification is extra nos, is extrinsic. Now, that was just the first session of Trent. Trent continued to go on to list a whole series of other doctrinal issues. The creeds of the Council of Trent are rather lengthy. Have been great if we wanted to read those and discuss those as a group, as a whole. But I thought that's too much. So that's why I gave you just Ignatius's spiritual exercises. But what is so significant about Trent is after they're finished, after the final session in 1563, when they close shop, the decrees of the Council of Trent come to function as a confessional document. If you remember, I mentioned that the Confession of Augsburg became the basis for the Reformation, the basis of Protestantism, the basis for the joining the League of Schmalkalden and what have you. The decrees of the Council of Trent were to be published throughout Catholic territories and lands, and were the standards that were to be inculcated, taught, and followed. And as I already mentioned, were so until the Second Vatican Council. So I'll be talking next week about confessionalization, and we really need to see the Council of Trent as a confessional document. And what we find with Trent and with these things is that what had been just the Catholic tradition, the Catholic Church, medieval Christendom, is splintered, and what we get is Roman Catholicism. That is a big difference. So this last slide, Roman Catholicism as a confession. Roman Catholicism becomes a confession. Now, there too, I have the Catholic Reform, Counter-Reformation, Early Modern Catholicism, those three terms I talked about at the beginning of this lecture. And really, I would suggest we approach this period from, let's say, 1400 to 1600 and then beyond, with early modern up to 1800, as early modern Catholicism, which encompassed Catholic Reform and Counter-Reformation. But what we do see is that the Catholic Church, the Catholic as universal, becomes Roman Catholicism. It becomes a confession during this 16th century, and thereby becomes more and more insular. Insularization and globalization of Roman Catholicism, because it does become more insular in the context of Europe and the emerging different confessional positions. And yet they also said at the same time, maybe consciously or not, and therefore we are going to put a lot of effort on our missionary activity in the Far East and in the New World. So that's why this insularization within Europe is combined, or was combined, with this new attempt at globalization of spreading now Roman Catholicism to the far reaches of the known world by Europeans at the time. That is, in some ways, the sense that the Roman Catholic Church is still in today, where it is strongest in areas outside of Europe and outside the United States. Now, I have up here to the emergence of denominations based on confessions. I have denominations in quotation marks because it was not a term used at the time. Denominations are what we talk about now. But what we used the term denomination for, in terms of Christianity today, are particular understandings and practices and positions within Christianity as such. And in that sense, we find denominations emerging within the Reformation writ large. And Roman Catholicism becomes a denomination. If we go to, again, back to that understanding of Catholic meaning universal, it was no longer universal. If I talk about the crumbling of Christendom and the end of Christendom, we no longer have a single confession. It's no longer a universal church, except at the most abstract level of Christianity as such. And the different confessions at the time didn't really necessarily recognize the other confessions as fully Christian. They're heretical. But here we have the emergence of denominations based on confessions. We have the Lutheran, Confession of Augsburg, and the Luther Small Catechism. We have the Calvinist based on Calvin's Institutes, and later confessions, the Heidelberg Confession. The Anglican confessional documents. Actually, the Anglicanism was a non-confessional position, but it was based on what unified it was the Book of Common Prayer and the 36 Articles. And then we have Roman Catholicism, the decrees of the Council of Trent, and the Roman Catechism, which came out in 1566. Now, I'll be talking more about confessionalization next week, because it is the new, let's say, myth that emerges, is the nation state as a result of the Reformation. We go from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. I'll be saying more about that next week as we kind of wrap up this course in the next 3 lectures. But I have here the end of the Catholic Church. What do I mean by that? I do not mean end as the goal, but I mean that the end of the Catholic Church, there's no longer a single church. There are increasing denominations. There's still Christianity. And today we talk about the Christian church as this abstract umbrella concept that embraces all forms of Christianity, almost. But the 16th century is really the end of the universal Christian church. It is the end of the Catholic Church and the emergence of confessional churches and state churches. And that implies, too, that the Reformation failed. Because the Reformation, Luther's views, Calvin's views, even Zwingli's views, their hope and their goal and their purpose was to bring about a reformation of the Catholic Church. What ended up was the splintering of it. That is something to consider. Also looking towards the final and answering the question about whether or not the Reformation was a revolution. talked about the failure thesis before, but this is too a part of it, not just in terms of having everyone become good Christian people as Luther thought they should be, but in terms of the ideals and the hopes that our purpose is to bring about a reformation of the Catholic Church, the universal Christian Church. And what happened? We have a splintering and a denominalization of it. And that itself was to have major impact on the rest of the development of Europe and of Christianity far after the 16th century. We'll wrap up next week, and then the following last lecture with the so what question, trying to put it all together. But we're almost done, but not quite yet. Thank you so much.